Have you ever been faced with a choice so big, so life-altering, that it made you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, honor, and love? Imagine this: a young soldier, standing between a girl and certain harm, takes the ultimate punishment for defending her. 30 lashes, his back torn, his spirit tested, and then the unimaginable happens. The very family of the girl he saved arrives at his doorstep not for revenge, but with a marriage pact, a bond stronger than any war, a commitment that defies the very laws that bind them. What would you do if your love crossed every boundary, every rule you've lived by? What if love didn't just change your life, but redefined who you are, who you can become? Would you embrace it, even if it meant risking everything? This is more than just a story of forbidden love. It's a tale of choosing what's right, what's brave, and what's worth the ultimate sacrifice. Now, imagine yourself in their shoes. Would you have the courage to stand for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you? If you're ready for a story that challenges your heart, stay tuned, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us on this incredible journey. A white soldier chose honor instead of hatred when he stepped between a Lakota girl and the punishment meant for her. The whip carved deep into his back, but it never touched his spirit. And when the dawn came, her father arrived not with war paint, but with beads of promise. The leather lash struck Caleb Whitlow for the 20th time, yet no sound escaped his lips. Blood coursed down his spine, gathering at the base of the post where his wrists were bound in ropes darkened with crimson. Colonel Abram Whitaker stood 10 paces away, his expression hard as stone, though his eyes betrayed a flicker each time the whip cracked through the air. Every man of Fort Resolute had been ordered to watch. 200 soldiers held their lines in silence while one of their own bore the weight of punishment. The official charge said he had defended a savage. Caleb knew better. 3 nights earlier, he had seen her eyes, wide with terror, as Sergeant Doyle and his companions trapped her near the quartermaster tent. Winona was no savage. She was barely 16, a Lakota girl who came only to trade beadwork for flour and sugar, helping her people endure another winter. The 21st lash landed with a wet snap that made even hardened men flinch. Caleb bit hard on the strap clamped between his teeth, tasting leather and iron, and knowing deep down he would do it all again. Sergeant Doyle had been drunk, his words slurred with whiskey and venom, his hands grasping where they had no right. His cronies had laughed as they blocked her way, their voices echoing against the wooden barracks. Caleb hadn't paused to consider consequences. His fist had found Doyle's jaw, dropping him into the dirt in a single blow. That moment ended the laughter but left Caleb facing a court-martial for striking a superior. The whipping post shuddered with each strike. By the 23rd blow, the world blurred at the edges of Caleb's sight like desert heat. In his haze, he remembered Winona's face as she knelt beside him after the brawl, pressing a torn scrap of her dress against the cut above his brow. She had whispered words in her own tongue. Caleb hadn't understood them, but the meaning had settled into his bones. Gratitude or sorrow. Before the guards dragged him off, she had pressed something into his palm, a small carved bird, smooth and warm from her hand. It waited now in his cell, if he lived through the remaining lashes. The crowd stirred as the 24th lash fell. Hoofbeats sounded at the north gate. Colonel Whitaker raised his hand, halting the next stroke. Caleb hung in his bonds, barely conscious, blood dripping to the packed earth. Through swollen eyes he saw riders entering Fort Resolute. 3 Lakota warriors, each seated with the ease of men born to the saddle. The one at the center was older, hair streaked with silver, a war shirt marked with quills and claws. His face bore the leathered lines of sun and grief, but his eyes were sharp as obsidian as they swept across the soldiers. Muskets twitched in nervous hands until Colonel Whitaker barked a command to hold their line. This was Chief Standing Elk, Winona's father. He had ridden into an armed fort with only 2 companions, a sign he came to speak, not to fight. His gaze found Caleb immediately, taking in the torn flesh and the blood at the post. For a heartbeat, something flickered across the chief's features. Surprise, perhaps recognition before he masked it with the careful calm of a man entering fragile negotiations. He dismounted with deliberate dignity, walking to meet Colonel Whitaker in the open space between them. Years of mistrust hung in that ground. When Standing Elk spoke, his English was steady, each word chosen as if lives rested upon it. "My daughter told me of the soldier who stood for her against his own," he said, his voice carrying clear over the still compound. "She told me of his courage and of the price he pays." Caleb felt those words strike him deeper than the lash. Winona had spoken of him to her father. She had told their story. Standing Elk's gaze shifted from the colonel back to the soldier tied to the post. 30 lashes is the sentence, Whitaker said stiffly. 30 lashes for striking a superior. Military justice, Chief Standing Elk, nothing personal. The chief's mouth curved faintly. "Justice," he repeated, as though testing the taste of the word. "White man's justice for defending a Lakota woman. That is a curious kind of justice indeed." The silence thickened. 200 soldiers waited for the spark that might turn words into bullets. But Standing Elk lifted his hand. Calm and steady, 6 lashes remain. I ask you to wait. Give me this day to speak with my people, to think on what I have seen here. Colonel Whitaker frowned, clearly uneasy, but something in the chief's bearing made him pause. He drew a slow breath. "Your daughter is safe," the colonel said carefully. "She returned to your camp unharmed thanks to Private Whitlow's intervention." Colonel Abram Whitaker's voice carried across Fort Resolute with the clipped tone of command. "She returned to your camp unharmed," he said, glancing at the battered man at the post. "Thanks to Private Caleb Whitlow's intervention." Chief Standing Elk inclined his head slowly, the long braids streaked with silver brushing against his shoulders. "She is safe in body," he said, his words deliberate, "but the heart and spirit do not heal so quickly." His eyes swept across the compound, over the ranks of soldiers stiff at attention, over the pale faces shifting uneasily as they watched the bleeding figure bound to the whipping post. "My daughter speaks of honor among your people," he continued. "She believes she has seen it in this young man's actions. I have come to see whether she speaks truly." The words hung like smoke on the morning air. Their meaning was heavier than the leather strap that had flayed Caleb's back. This was no longer about military punishment or the strike of a fist against a drunken sergeant. This was about something larger, more dangerous. It was about the possibility of understanding between 2 peoples who had known only hatred. Colonel Whitaker felt his jaw tighten. He sensed that if he misstepped now, the ground beneath Fort Resolute could ignite. Standing Elk remained still as stone. His weathered hands rested calmly before him, his dark eyes fixed on the young soldier who sagged in his bonds but somehow still breathed. Behind the chief, 2 warriors sat their horses without a twitch, their expressions unreadable masks of control. They were men ready for violence if need arose, yet hoping their presence would be enough to keep peace. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, Whitaker gave a short nod, his voice gruff with reluctant respect. Private Whitlow will remain secured until morning. The remainder of the sentence will be carried out then unless— His words trailed away. Even he did not know what alternative he had just left hanging in the air. Caleb barely registered what was being said. His back burned like a river of fire, every breath dragging knives through his lungs. Blood had soaked the waistband of his uniform trousers. His wrists were raw where the ropes had cut. Yet, in the fog of pain, one thing pierced through. He heard Winona's name spoken with tenderness. Standing, Elk was talking about her, about honor and courage, about choices that weighed more than regulations written in Washington. Caleb tried to lift his head to prove he was still conscious, still part of this strange turning of fate. The effort sent sparks of darkness scattering before his eyes, but he managed to lock his gaze on the chief, and in the elder's face he saw something he had not expected. Not pity, not even thanks, but the kind of measuring respect a father gives when deciding the worth of a man near his daughter. The Lakota leader stepped closer to the whipping post until his presence loomed like a shield. In a low voice, meant only for Caleb, he spoke in the steady English. "My daughter sees your heart, young soldier. She tells me of eyes that carry no hatred, of hands that shield instead of harm. She asks many questions about the man who chose pain rather than silence." Caleb's throat was too dry to answer. His lips cracked as he forced the smallest of nods, and the movement sent fresh fire down his spine. Standing, Elk studied him for a long moment, then reached into a pouch at his belt. From within he drew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin. He unwrapped it carefully and held it where Caleb could see. It was the carved bird Winona had pressed into his palm the night he defended her. Only now it hung from a delicate string of blue and white beads that caught the light like tiny fragments of sky. She made this for the man who stood between her and shame. The chief said quietly, "But she fears to give it. She fears white soldiers do not take gifts from Lakota women. She fears that honor may be punished twice." The words struck Caleb harder than any lash. His body throbbed with pain, but the ache in his chest came from knowing she worried for him, that even now she was weaving hope with her own hands while he bled for both of them. He fought to speak. What came out was only a hoarse whisper, but Standing Elk bent close to catch it. "Tell her," Caleb rasped. "Tell her it was worth it. Every lash, every moment. She is worth it all." The chief's eyes flickered, surprise mingled with approval. He straightened slowly, turning his gaze toward Colonel Whitaker, who had been watching with growing unease. The weight of the moment pressed down upon the fort. 200 soldiers sensed that what they were witnessing was not routine discipline, but something that could change the course of lives and nations. Standing, Elk walked back toward the colonel with deliberate steps. Every soldier's musket remained trained, yet no man dared break the silence. When the chief spoke, his voice was loud and measured so all could hear. "Colonel Whitaker, you are a man of war, but you are also a man of honor. I have seen it in how you command your men, how you keep your word even when it costs you." Whitaker's face remained set, but Caleb saw the faint tightening at his eyes. The compliment had struck true. "My daughter has told me of this soldier," the chief went on. She has told me of the one who defended her honor at the price of his own body. She told me of a man who chose justice over safety, who stood against his own to protect what was right. These are not the actions of an enemy. These are the actions of a man whose heart walks in the light. He paused, letting his words settle. The compound was so still that the creak of leather saddles carried across the yard. Everyone sensed that the chief was about to reveal the true purpose of his presence. "In our ways," Standing Elk said, his voice firm, "such deeds create debts that must be honored." The statement landed like a drumbeat. Soldiers shifted on their boots, understanding without fully comprehending. This was not the language of military courts. This was the voice of a leader who measured justice differently. Caleb sagged against his bonds, fighting to stay awake, fighting to hold on to each word. He had stepped into the fray that night because it was the only thing his conscience allowed. He had not thought of consequences. Yet here stood the girl's father, a chief whose people had fought Whitaker's men for years, speaking of honor, of debts, of light. The tension at Fort Resolute was like a bowstring pulled taut. Every man knew one misstep could turn this into slaughter. Yet within that silence hung something else. Fragile but undeniable, the possibility of peace born out of one soldier's instinct to protect. Standing Elk's words were not just for Caleb, not even for Whitaker alone. They were for all who stood within those palisade walls. He was planting an idea, dangerous yet precious, that honor could be seen on both sides, that a Lakota chief might call a white soldier's courage by its true name. Colonel Whitaker's mind raced. His training screamed for discipline, for the steady hand of protocol. Yet something deeper stirred a recognition that he was standing in a moment larger than regulations. Before him was not merely a bruised private and a defiant chief. Before him was the possibility that bloodshed might be interrupted by respect. The sun climbed higher over the north gate, its light catching on the string of beads in the Standing Elk's hand. The blue and white glimmered like a sliver of heaven caught on earth. Caleb's vision blurred, but he knew what he was seeing. It was not just a token. It was proof that even in the midst of cruelty, something beautiful could be born. The chief lowered the beaded bird back into his pouch with reverence. His gaze never left the colonel. "Among my people," he said slowly, "such debts cannot be ignored. When a man risks himself to protect what is precious, the family must answer. This is our way. It is not vengeance. It is not bargaining. It is the bond of honor." His voice carried to the farthest ranks, and no man present would ever forget it. When a man gives everything to protect what is sacred to another family, that family cannot simply look away. It is a debt deeper than gratitude. That is what Chief Standing Elk told them, his voice carrying across the parade ground of Fort Resolute with the calm force of truth. Colonel Abram Whitaker's hand drifted toward his sidearm, his instincts honed by years of frontier service. Yet Standing Elk lifted his own hand, palm out, the universal sign of peace. His words were steady. "I do not speak of violence, Colonel. What I speak of is far more dangerous than war. I speak of understanding." The sound of those words unsettled the garrison more than the crack of the whip had. A ripple passed through the soldiers, men who had been raised to think of the Lakota only as enemies. Some muttered under their breath, others stared wide-eyed, struggling to make sense of the chief's calm defiance. Whitaker's sharp command stilled them. Silence fell again, heavy as lead. Standing Elk reached into a pouch slung at his hip. He drew out a bundle wrapped in leather and tied with sinew, decorated with tiny shells that clicked softly in the breeze. He cradled it with reverence, as though it carried the weight of centuries. His voice deepened. This belonged to my father, and to his father before him. 7 generations of chiefs have carried it. It is brought forth only in matters of greatest importance. Caleb Whitlow, still straining to remain conscious, watched through a blur of blood and exhaustion. His back screamed with pain, his wrists raw and numb from the ropes, but his gaze fixed on the bundle. With deliberate care, Standing Elk unwrapped the covering. Gasps rose from among the soldiers. The object revealed was no weapon, no trinket. It was a ceremonial pipe, carved from the red stone of the sacred quarries, decorated with intricate designs that seemed to ripple like water. The chief held it high for all to see. I offer to smoke the pipe of peace with the soldier who defended my daughter. Standing Elk declared. His voice rang clear, carrying the weight of generations. I offer to bind his honor to ours, to make him family through the ancient ways of my people. The words fell on the fort like thunder. The meaning was unmistakable. This was no mere gesture of thanks. It was a marriage pact. A collective murmur rolled through the ranks. Some soldiers gaped openly. Others looked away as if they had witnessed blasphemy. To offer his daughter's hand to a white soldier was something no Lakota chief had ever done. To the men of the garrison, it was unthinkable. Colonel Whitaker's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. The sheer weight of the offer crashed down upon him. Military law, government policy, the fragile balance of frontier politics, everything trembled in the shadow of Standing Elk's words. Caleb swayed in his bonds, the world tilting around him. Through the fog of agony, he heard the offer, and for a moment hope pierced the haze like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Marriage to Winona, the girl whose terrified eyes he could not forget, whose gentle touch had been the last kindness he had felt before being dragged to the post. The carved bird she had pressed into his palm now seemed to burn against his skin. Yet, even as that fragile hope flared, a darker tide surged. The Army's rules were iron. To marry a Lakota woman would mean a court-martial, discharge and disgrace, exile from the only life he had ever known. He would lose everything: rank, home, family back in Ohio. Standing Elk studied him with eyes both sharp and kind. The old man seemed to sense his turmoil. His voice softened, almost fatherly. I know the cost, young soldier. I know what choosing my daughter would mean for your life among the whites. But I also know what choosing honor has already cost you. And I see that you do not regret the price. His gaze shifted to the blood-soaked post, then back to Caleb's battered face. My daughter dreams of eyes without hatred. She dreams of hands that guard, not destroy. She dreams of a man who would endure suffering rather than choose silence, who would risk everything for what is right. She dreams of you, Caleb Whitlow. The sound of his name jolted Caleb as though struck by lightning. He had never spoken it to her. During that brief and violent night, 3 days passed. No introductions had been exchanged. Yet somehow she had learned it. She had asked questions. She had spoken of him to her father. The thought that Winona had been thinking of him, dreaming of him, filled Caleb with a warmth that momentarily dulled the fire in his back. For the first time since he had arrived, Standing Elk's lips curved into a true smile, faint but genuine. She is young, but her sight is clear. She sees a man worth 30 lashes, worth the anger of his own people, worth the risk of all he holds dear. She has asked me to offer what our people have never offered before: a place in our family, a bond that cannot be broken by war, by hatred, or by time. Colonel Whitaker stepped forward, his boots grinding on the packed earth. His face was a study in conflicting emotions. Duty urged him to refuse outright. Army law forbade such fraternization, let alone marriage. As commander, he should crush this proposal before it could spark further unrest. But Whitaker had just watched 30 lashes fall upon a man for nothing more than protecting a girl. He had watched Caleb endure it without flinching, his silence a rebuke to cruelty. And he had heard the sincerity in Standing Elk's voice. The offer was not merely about one soldier and one Lakota girl. It was about peace itself. If a single act of courage could bridge the canyon carved by decades of bloodshed, what kind of man would he be to destroy that chance before it was even tested? The silence stretched until it quivered like a bowstring at full draw. Every soldier in the yard stood frozen, sensing that they were witnessing something far greater than punishment. Caleb hung limp at the post, his thoughts spinning. The weight of his wounds pressed down on him, but heavier still was the possibility that had just been placed before him. A future with Winona, a life torn from the path of war and bound instead by love. It was impossible, yet it was real, hanging there in the balance. Around him, 200 men held their breath. What happened next would not only decide Caleb Whitlow's fate, it could alter the relationship between white soldiers and Lakota warriors for a generation. Colonel Whitaker's features twisted with the struggle within him. Duty warred with conscience. Protocol clashed with something he didn't have a name for. His eyes darted between Standing Elk's steady gaze and Caleb's broken form. Standing Elk did not waver. He had faced these crossroads before, in battles and councils, in seasons of hunger and years of plenty. He knew patience was stronger than force. He stood with the infinite calm of a man who had learned to negotiate survival through words as much as through weapons. The ceremonial pipe remained in his hands, its red stone gleaming in the morning sun. Its presence alone carried the power of generations, a promise that choices made here could not be easily undone. The soldiers of Fort Resolute shifted uneasily. They were trained to obey, to strike, to kill if ordered. Yet now they watched their colonel hesitate before a Lakota chief. They saw not an enemy, but a father, a man of dignity offering peace in the most personal form imaginable. For Caleb, the world narrowed to two truths: the throbbing pain in his body and the image of Winona's eyes, dark with fear that night, but filled with trust when she pressed the bird into his hand. He had not saved her to gain a reward. Yet here, bleeding and broken, he found himself offered a gift greater than anything he had ever dreamed. And still, doubt pressed hard. Could he abandon everything he knew? Could he walk away from the army, from his family, from the world of his birth? Could he embrace a life that would brand him as a traitor to his own people? Standing, Elk seemed to sense his turmoil. His voice was gentle but unwavering. Young soldier, sometimes the heart must choose where the mind cannot. My daughter sees in you a man who walks in light. She asks me to give you this choice, not as command, not as obligation, but as the path of honor. The yard was silent, but for the wind moving across the prairie grass beyond the stockade. Colonel Whitaker swallowed hard. feeling the eyes of 200 men on him. He knew that what was happening here would follow him for the rest of his life. And yet, watching Caleb's head sag against the ropes, watching Standing Elk's calm patience, he understood this moment was larger than regulations, larger than him. What choice Caleb Whitlow made now would echo long after the blood on the ground had dried. Caleb Whitlow swallowed against the rawness in his throat, trying to push words past the bitterness of leather and blood. The offer Chief Standing Elk had made hung in the air like smoke over the morning prairie. It was not merely a proposal. It was a challenge to everything Caleb had ever known about duty, loyalty, and the rigid lines drawn between the white man and the Lakota. The chief's request went far beyond the usual formalities of frontier life. He was not asking for prisoners to be exchanged, or for territory to be returned. He was asking Caleb to step across a line no other soldier had ever crossed. He was asking for a bond of kinship, a commitment to family that no law or officer could annul. He was asking Caleb to become part of the Lakota people, to weave himself into a lineage older than the forts, older than the maps on which generals drew boundaries. Standing Elk held the ceremonial pipe in his hands, the red stone glowing like coals in the sunlight. It was an emblem of sacred promises, a commitment that once spoken could not be retracted. Behind him, 2 warriors on horseback remained motionless. Their faces were stoic, betraying nothing of their thoughts, but Caleb felt their alertness like a current in the air. They had followed their chief into the heart of Fort Resolute, relying on trust. Yet even trust could be tested by the gravity of the moment. The younger warrior, his long hair braided and scars crisscrossing his cheek, kept a hand near the hilt of his knife, eyes flicking over every corner of the fort as though expecting treachery at any instant. The elder warrior, his face etched with years of survival and authority, watched Standing Elk with measured intensity. Every muscle in his body seemed prepared to act instantly if his chief were threatened. This was no ordinary negotiation. The stakes were mortal. Caleb's lips moved, rasping out the question he could not keep inside. "Your daughter. She barely knows me. How could she? How could you?" His voice came out as a whisper, strained and hoarse, yet every word trembled with the weight of his bewilderment. Standing Elk's expression softened, the corners of his mouth lifting as if to smile, though the seriousness of his eyes never wavered. "Do you think a moment of pain can tell the whole story of a man's heart?" he asked gently. "My daughter sees more than you think. She sees a soldier who could have walked away, who could have let others handle the violence, who could have chosen safety over justice." The chief's voice carried an authority born of generations, cutting through Caleb's haze of exhaustion and pain. In those few minutes at the post, you revealed more of your true character than most men reveal in a lifetime. You showed her a heart that chooses right over ease, that protects those who cannot protect themselves, even when the cost is high. You showed her the kind of man she has long dreamed of since she first understood what honor truly means. Caleb's vision blurred as tears mixed with blood and sweat. He did not cry from the pain of the lashes, or the rawness of rope burning into his wrists. He cried from the recognition that someone had truly seen him in that brief, excruciating moment. He had acted without thought of reward, without concern for consequence, and yet that act had been understood, honored, and elevated into something sacred. Colonel Whitaker cleared his throat, sharp enough to pierce the tension thickening around the post. His tone was cautious, measured, but carried the authority of rank. "Chief Standing Elk," he said, "what you are proposing is unprecedented. It is not a matter of simple courtesy or military custom. It touches laws set by Congress and policies from the War Department. I do not possess the authority to approve such an arrangement. The implications are vast." Standing, Elk inclined his head, acknowledging the colonel without diminishing the weight of his offer. "I understand, Colonel. This is not a matter for your books or your regulations. This is a matter of the heart, of honor, and of the future of our people. I offer my daughter not because I disregard the law, but because I know a man's worth is not counted in rules alone. Caleb Whitlow has already paid a debt too great for rules to measure." The words settled over the soldiers like a slow wind. Caleb felt the eyes of the fort upon him, some curious, some skeptical, some silently questioning whether such a bridge between worlds could survive the scrutiny of men who lived by orders and not instinct. Standing, Elk moved closer, the pipe still in his hands. Winona has seen courage where others saw only opportunity. She has seen loyalty where others saw duty, and she has seen something deeper, the will to act with integrity even when the cost is unbearable. That is why I bring this offer to you." Caleb swallowed, trying to steady his voice. I cannot just accept this. The consequences, my life, my duty, my home." His words faltered, drowned in the thrum of his own heartbeat. The chief placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "No man of honor chooses lightly. I do not demand your answer now. You may return to your quarters, but know this, the offer is genuine. And know this as well, a man's courage is measured not only by the battles he fights, but by the truth he keeps, even when it is perilous." The wind stirred, catching the edges of the ceremonial pipe's leather bundle, whispering against the shells that adorned it. Caleb felt a profound sense of awe, a sense of connection to a lineage older than the forts, older than any man who claimed authority over the prairie. He realized that the choice laid before him was larger than his own life. It was a choice about allegiance, about justice, about the measure of a man in the eyes of those who truly understand. The younger warrior shifted slightly, alert but respectful, while the elder remained immovable, a sentinel to the sacredness of the moment. Caleb could see the unspoken trust between Standing Elk and his warriors, the kind of loyalty forged in decades of hardship and responsibility. It dawned on him that he was not merely choosing for himself, but stepping into a chain that bound past, present, and future generations. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice steadier, resonating with a mixture of fear and resolve. I need time to consider. This is not just about me or her. It is about everything I've been taught, everything I have sworn to uphold. Give me a day to think." Standing. Elk nodded, eyes solemn but approving. "Take the time you need, but know that courage waits for no man, and opportunity for honor visits only once." Colonel Whitaker, still uneasy, stepped forward. "Caleb," he said, tone gentle but firm, "remember that no matter what, the Army's rules have their consequences. Whatever choice you make, it will not be without cost." Caleb nodded, his mind spinning with the enormity of the offer, the raw truth of Standing Elk's assessment of him, and the fragile hope that perhaps some bonds were stronger than law, stronger than fear. As he was led back toward the barracks, he felt the gaze of Chief Standing Elk upon him, steady and unwavering. And behind that gaze, Caleb sensed a challenge not just to his courage, but to his very understanding of honor, family, and what it meant to bridge worlds. For the first time since his ordeal at the whipping post, he felt the stirrings of a possibility he had never dared imagine, a future where loyalty and love could defy even the strictest of rules. And, across the prairie, the ceremonial pipe rested in Standing Elk's hands, a silent testament to a promise that could change two lives forever, and perhaps even begin to heal the long, bitter divides between their peoples. The news that arrived next hit like a strike to the gut. The territorial governor's orders were clear. Immediate action was required. The whispers were already circulating about assembling a punitive expedition, and the Lakota were the ones to pay. Their land, their people, already overburdened by years of violence and betrayal, were now on the verge of being blamed for something that might not even have been their doing. Caleb Whitlow's gaze met Chief Standing Elk's, and in that moment they both understood that this fragile peace was about to shatter. Standing Elk's face tightened as the weight of this new reality pressed down on him. The chief had come here in peace, offering marriage, offering kinship, an offer that could heal centuries of wounds. Yet, the winds of the wider world were threatening to destroy it all. War was being stirred in the very air they breathed, as the cries of the bloodthirsty echoed from beyond the gates of the fort. The brutality of the frontier seemed to wait for no one. Colonel Abram Whitaker's face drained of color. His mind raced as the implications of this new directive hit him. With the violence escalating and political pressure mounting, the last thing he could afford was to be seen negotiating with the Lakota. He had worked too hard to establish his position, to hold the tenuous peace that still existed on the frontier. The lieutenant's voice broke the silence, laced with urgency. "Sir, there's more. Word is coming in from Washington. A special investigator's on his way to review our handling of Native relations in this region." The words hung heavy in the air, their meaning sinking in with each passing second. Questions have been raised about our methods, our success rates, our discipline procedures. The lieutenant continued, glancing uncomfortably at Caleb, still bound to the whipping post, and then back at the colonel. Whitaker's jaw clenched, the weight of the situation becoming unbearable. The arrival of a federal investigator meant that everything, every decision, would come under scrutiny. Every action he had taken, every compromise, every risk was now at the mercy of Washington's judgment. If word reached the capital that he had allowed a Lakota chief to negotiate a marriage between his daughter and a white soldier, the political fallout would not only ruin his career, it could dismantle the entire structure of military command on the frontier. Yet, as his eyes flickered to Caleb, bloodied but still standing with a dignity that the colonel could not ignore, something inside him hesitated. The young soldier was not just a man who had endured 30 lashes. He was a man who had made a choice that transcended the rules of war. He had acted on instinct, on honor, and the raw honesty in his eyes made Whitaker wonder if perhaps the world of regulations, of duty and obedience, was not the only way forward. Standing Elk's voice, low and measured, drew Whitaker's attention back to the present. "I know the pressures you face. Colonel, I know your government demands action against my people," he began, his voice steady. "But I also know that some of the attacks that have been attributed to the Lakota were not done by our hands. There are others, raiders from the Pawnee, white men who dress as Indians to cover their tracks. They use this violence to destroy any chance of peace between our people. You know this is true. Whitaker's shoulders stiffened at the mention of false flag attacks. The idea that white men disguised as Native Americans could sow chaos for profit was not new. He had long suspected as much, but proving that the violence attributed to the Lakota was, in fact, orchestrated by outsiders was nearly impossible. Politics, however, demanded that someone pay the price for the wagon trains that had been burned, for the families scattered across the plains. The Lakota were an easy target. They were visible. They were a known entity, and they carried the blame of every massacre, every raid, whether or not they were responsible. "I understand," Chief, Whitaker muttered, rubbing his brow in frustration. "But the reality is, my orders remain unchanged, whether it's true or not. I can't afford to look like I'm allowing negotiation when the governor demands action." Standing, Elk stepped forward, his presence commanding but unthreatening. "Then let us act quickly. Colonel, before your responsibilities make choice impossible, let me speak with the young soldier one more time. Let him decide his fate while there is still time for a decision." Caleb, weak and disoriented from the pain and exhaustion, had been listening to the conversation with growing desperation. The mention of the federal investigator, the mounting pressure, the threat of violence, it all pointed to the collapse of the fragile moment of peace that had hung between him and Winona's family. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, one thought burned through the fog of his pain. Winona had asked her father to offer him marriage. She had seen something in him, something he hadn't even recognized in himself. She had chosen him despite everything. The carved bird with its blue and white beads seemed to pulse in his mind, a promise of love, of belonging, that transcended the hatred and violence of the world they lived in. It was the only thing that kept his focus as Standing Elk approached him, his steps measured, deliberate. The chief stopped just within reach, his weathered hand extending, gently steadying Caleb's swaying form. "Young soldier," he said softly, his voice carrying the authority of a father speaking to his son, "I see death creeping at the edges of your eyes. These lashes have taken more from you than your commanders ever intended." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He could barely lift his head, but somehow he knew that what Standing Elk said next would change everything. "I must tell you something," the chief continued, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "My daughter, Winona, asked me to tell you that she dreamed of you long before this moment ever came. She dreamed of a man who would choose honor over ease, a man who would act with courage when others would have turned away. She dreamed of you." Caleb's breath caught in his chest. The pain, the blood, the confusion, it all seemed to disappear in that moment, swept away by the power of Standing Elk's words. Winona had dreamed of him, and not just as a soldier in the fight, but as something more. The chief's voice softened further. "She asked me to offer you the chance to join our people, to become one of us, to join her in a life where honor is more important than blood, where love can exist between us, despite all that has come before." Caleb tried to nod, his vision swimming, but the agony in his back made the movement impossible. Still, he understood. Standing Elk wasn't asking for a simple yes or no. He was offering Caleb the chance to choose a life where his heart and actions were judged not by the laws of men, but by the laws of honor. The world had grown silent. Every soldier, every warrior present felt the weight of the moment. They were witnesses to something that would echo through history, a moment where two worlds could either collide in violence or unite in understanding. The tension was so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. Caleb lifted his head, and for the first time since he had been whipped, he felt clarity. The pain no longer consumed him. His choice, whatever it would be, would define not just his future, but the future of two people standing on the edge of a precipice. Iron Bear stood with him, the weight of centuries on his shoulders, offering Caleb a path forward, a path that had never been walked by any white man before him, a path that could reshape everything. The question was not just whether Caleb would take it, but whether he could make peace with the consequences of that choice. As the tension in the compound reached its peak, Caleb knew he had to decide, and whatever he chose, it would change the course of his life forever. The weight of Iron Bear's words pressed on Caleb Whitlow like a heavy, suffocating cloak. He had already suffered so much, endured a punishment few could fathom, and yet now he was being asked to make a choice that could tear apart everything he had ever known. It wasn't just about leaving the military, about walking away from the life he had built in the Army. It was about a future that seemed as foreign as the world he had just crossed into. His mind raced, but his body felt heavier with every passing second. His wounds, still fresh and raw, throbbed with pain, but somehow, that was the least of what he felt now. It was the decision ahead that consumed him. Iron Bear's dark eyes did not waver, though there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. The chief was asking him to leave behind his past, his duty, everything he had ever been, and embrace a future that would not be his to control. "The offer I make," Iron Bear continued, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of generations, "is not something any Lakota has ever extended to a white man. But my daughter sees in you something different. She sees honor in you. She sees a man willing to risk everything for what is right, for the dignity of a woman in need, and for that she asks you to be part of our family, to stand beside her, not as a curiosity, but as one of us." Caleb tried to process the enormity of the situation, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He had never imagined this. He had only known the harsh realities of the frontier, the laws of men, the brutality of war, the violence that ruled their world. But now, in the face of Iron Bear's offer, everything he thought he knew was being questioned. "Winona has asked me to bring you this offer," Iron Bear continued, his voice solemn, "and she believes that what I offer may be worth more than what you would lose." The chief paused, his eyes softening as he spoke of his daughter, and for the first time, Caleb saw a glimpse of the father behind the powerful leader. Caleb's breath hitched in his chest. The thought of losing everything, his military career, his home, his place in a world he knew, was unbearable. He had always been a soldier, but now, a woman, a daughter of this powerful chief, was asking him to risk it all. "What would happen to her if I say no?" Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible, a question that felt too heavy for words. Iron Bear's face grew serious, a shadow passing over the chief's features. She would accept it, as she accepts all things that cannot be changed. She would marry a man from our own people, someone who can provide her with a life of peace and stability. She would raise children, live a good life, as any woman should. Caleb closed his eyes, the weight of the decision sinking deep into his bones. But then, Iron Bear spoke again, and his words cut through the sorrowful haze that had begun to cloud his thoughts. But she would always wonder about the white soldier who chose honor over safety, the one who risked everything for a stranger's dignity. She would always wonder what could have been. The idea of Winona living the rest of her life wondering what if was almost more than Caleb could bear. Her heart had chosen him in a moment of courage. But could he live with the knowledge that he had not reciprocated that choice behind him? The compound was slowly returning to its usual routine. Soldiers, who had witnessed the remarkable exchange between Caleb and Iron Bear, were moving back to their posts, the reality of military life slowly encroaching once more. The patrols were being debriefed, and the machinery of frontier warfare was grinding back into motion, reminding everyone that their brief moment of peace was about to come to an end. But Iron Bear's two warriors remained poised and alert, their presence a constant reminder of the fragile peace they had created. The older warrior, whose features bore the marks of countless battles, gave a subtle gesture toward the sky, his eyes shifting to the sun. Time was running out. They needed to act quickly if they were to return to their own land before nightfall. Caleb felt the pressure of time closing in on him, and he knew the moment of decision was almost upon him. Standing beside Iron Bear, he could feel the weight of the chief's silent urgency, the quiet understanding that the longer they waited, the harder it would be for Caleb to make a choice that would affect both of their peoples. "I cannot give you long to decide," Iron Bear said gently, but with the quiet force of a man who had lived through countless battles. "My presence here grows more dangerous with each passing moment. Already, there are those among your people who will see treachery in my approach, and among my people, there are those who will see weakness in offering kinship to a white man. We are at a crossroads, young soldier, and I cannot guarantee what will happen next." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his mind torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the unexpected offer that had been laid before him. The consequences of his decision were monumental. He could accept the offer and leave the life he had known, or he could refuse and live with the certainty that he would never see Winona again, that the path he might have walked with her would close forever. The chief's words rang in his ears, each one carrying the weight of history and tradition. If Caleb accepted, he would not just be marrying Winona, he would be joining a new family, a new world. His identity as a soldier, as a man of the frontier, would be wiped away, replaced with something he had never imagined. Iron Bear reached into his pouch and pulled out the ceremonial pipe, a sacred object that had been passed down through 7 generations. He held it up for Caleb to see, the intricate carvings on the pipe telling a story of unity, of peace, and of promises made that could never be broken. "This pipe," Iron Bear said, "has sealed treaties, ended wars, blessed marriages, and bound families together across generations. If you choose to accept my daughter's offer, we will smoke it together. You will become my son, and you will be joined with my people in a way that no man can undo." The weight of the pipe in Iron Bear's hands seemed to symbolize everything that was at stake. Caleb's heart raced as he realized that this was no ordinary decision. This was a crossroads, a moment that would change the course of his life forever. He would not just be choosing a path for himself, he would be shaping the future for both the Lakota and the white man, for two peoples who had lived in opposition for so long. "I do not ask for your immediate answer," Iron Bear added, sensing the gravity of the situation. "I ask only for your willingness to consider it. What you choose next will be a step into a new world, one where honor and love transcend the old ways, where a man's heart is judged not by his blood, but by his actions." Caleb looked at the pipe in Iron Bear's hands, the promise of peace and kinship that it represented, and he felt a sense of clarity begin to form within him. His heart told him that the answer was not as simple as yes or no. It was a question of courage, of love, and of the future he wanted to shape, not just for himself, but for Winona, for the Lakota people, and for a world that had been torn apart by hatred for too long. The time for decision was fast approaching, and Caleb knew that whatever choice he made, it would change the lives of everyone in the fort, and perhaps even beyond. But as he looked at Iron Bear, at the family he had been offered, he began to understand something about himself, something he hadn't known before. Perhaps the greatest act of courage was not fighting with a weapon, but choosing a path of peace, a path of love. And in that moment, Caleb Whitlow knew that his life would never be the same again. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on Caleb Whitlow's chest as he tried to imagine what his life would be like beyond the familiar call of military duty. Would he truly leave it all behind? The thought of leaving the army was terrifying. The rigid structure, the certainty of orders and rank had always been a constant. But now, standing at the edge of an unknown future, he wondered what a life in a Lakota village would feel like. Would he learn their language, their customs? Would he hunt buffalo with them instead of drilling with cavalry units? He couldn't picture it fully. Yet something about the idea was deeply compelling. It was a life of purpose, of meaning, something he had never felt in the trenches of war. Chief Standing Elk watched Caleb intently as the young soldier wrestled with this impossible decision. Iron Bear's steady gaze never wavered as Caleb found his voice, growing stronger with every word. "Your daughter, Winona," Caleb began, his voice shaky at first but gaining strength. "She saved my soul that night. Just as surely as I tried to protect her body, she saved me. I've been thinking about her every moment since they dragged me away, wondering if I'd ever see her again, if she was safe, if she understood why I had to act." He paused, taking a moment to gather himself, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But he had to say this. He had to speak the truth that had been festering within him since that moment on the ground, when he had stood between Winona and the men who would have hurt her. "I've been in love with her since the moment she pressed that carved bird into my hand," Caleb confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I barely know her name or the sound of her voice, but in that one act, that single moment, something in me changed. I've dreamed of a life with her, a life I never thought possible, a life with a woman who saw something in me that I'm still trying to understand." Iron Bear's face softened slightly, and for the first time, Caleb saw a flicker of genuine emotion in the chief's stern features. He had spoken with the authority of a leader throughout their conversation, but now there was something almost paternal in the way he regarded Caleb. His voice was calm but steady as he spoke. "Then you accept," Iron Bear said, his words hanging in the air, charged with the gravity of everything that had transpired. "You will leave your soldier's life behind and become my daughter's husband, my son. You will join our family, our people. This decision is not just about you, Caleb Whitlow. It's about all of us, our future, our people. Your answer will shape not only your future, but the future of our people, and the relationship between our worlds." Caleb felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His answer could change everything, not just for him and Winona, but for the future of both the Lakota and the white soldiers. His mind spun, the enormity of the decision almost too much to bear. But as Iron Bear's words settled in, something deep within Caleb stirred. This was a crossroads, a choice that would either bind two worlds together or push them further apart. Before he could respond, a new sound broke through the stillness of the compound, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves approaching fast. Caleb's heart skipped a beat, and as he turned, his eyes caught sight of a small group of Lakota women riding into the compound. Their horses were draped with colorful ribbons, and the fine beadwork on their clothing made their presence unmistakable. These were no ordinary riders, they were members of the chief's family. At the center of the group was Winona. Caleb's breath caught in his chest, even through the haze of his exhaustion and pain. Her beauty struck him like a physical blow. She sat her horse with the grace of someone born to the saddle, her long black hair braided with blue and white beads, the same beads that decorated the carved bird she had given him. Her eyes locked onto his as soon as she entered the compound, and in that gaze, Caleb saw everything he needed to know. This was his future, standing right before him. Her presence in that moment was transformative, shifting the atmosphere from a tense standoff between two conflicting worlds to something that felt almost mystical. It was as if the spirits themselves had conspired to bring these two hearts together, despite the walls of hatred and history that had divided them for so long. Winona dismounted with the fluid grace of someone at ease in her own skin. Despite the formal attire, she wore a stunning buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork that shimmered in the afternoon sun. Her movements were deliberate and dignified, and every step she took toward him made Caleb's heart race faster. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. But there was no turning back now. This was where his path led. As she approached, the other women with her formed a respectful semicircle, adding weight and ceremony to the already unprecedented moment. Caleb's throat tightened, and he could hardly breathe as she closed the distance between them. Her eyes never left his face, and despite the pain that radiated through his body, he felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over him. Colonel Whitaker stood at the edge of the scene, watching with a look of utter disbelief. The protocol that had defined his command for so long was now irrelevant. The arrival of these Lakota women was unprecedented, and the sight of Winona walking toward Caleb with the grace of a queen seemed to shatter the last remnants of the military world he had fought so hard to control. His mind raced through the possible consequences. He thought of federal investigators, of territorial governors, of the press that would seize on the story of a soldier marrying a Lakota woman, sensationalizing it and distorting the truth. But despite all that, there was something about Winona's presence, her dignity, and the calm strength she projected as she walked toward Caleb that made it impossible for Whitaker to simply dismiss her. When Winona finally stopped in front of Caleb, their eyes met. She studied him, her face showing a mixture of pain and determination. The depth of her emotion was clear pain from seeing him suffer, gratitude for his survival, and something deeper, something that Caleb recognized as love, the same love he had felt for her since the moment they first met. She spoke then, her English careful but precise, each word chosen with the care of someone who had prepared for this moment. "I asked my father to wait for me to see you before you gave your answer. I needed to look in your eyes again, to be certain that what I saw that night was real." Caleb, struggling to straighten himself against the post, met her gaze. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony, but he refused to let her see his pain. He wanted her to see the man he was, strong, resolute, and certain of his feelings for her. Ayanna, he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips, but it felt like a prayer, like a promise. In that simple moment, Caleb knew that this was the moment that would define his life. The future he had never dared to imagine was now before him. Caleb Whitlow's body was broken, his back still raw from the 30 lashes he had endured, but his spirit had shifted, transformed in a way he hadn't expected. Each moment spent with Winona over the past days replayed in his mind, each one more vivid than the last. The dream of a life that seemed impossible had now become something real, something tangible. In the silence of his suffering, he knew one thing for sure: he was in love with Winona. He had been from the moment she pressed that carved bird into his palm, a gesture that had meant more to him than anything in his life before. His heart ached with the recognition that something extraordinary had happened. In the face of all that had been broken, she had seen him not just the soldier, but the man beneath the uniform. He looked up at Chief Iron Bear as the chief spoke softly, his words breaking the air around them. My daughter, Winona, told me that in the brief 3 minutes you stood between her and those men, she saw the man she had been waiting for her entire life. She didn't see hatred in your eyes. She saw no anger toward her people, only toward the injustice that threatened her. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as Iron Bear continued, describing how Winona had seen the gentleness in his actions, how she recognized a man of honor even in a brief moment of violence. She told me, Iron Bear's voice deepened, that when you smiled at her before they dragged you away, she saw the man she wanted to grow old with, not because you were strong enough to fight for her, but because you were brave enough to sacrifice everything for a stranger's dignity. The words hit Thomas harder than the lashes had, bringing an unfamiliar warmth to his chest. A realization washed over him. She had recognized something in him that he hadn't even understood about himself. The tenderness in Winona's heart, her belief in him, had made all of this worth it. Iron Bear's next words were quieter, almost tender. She has carried the memory of you, the memory of your honor, every day since that night, and she made this for you. Iron Bear reached into his pouch and pulled out a necklace, the delicate blue and white beads shimmering in the sun. The carved bird from that night, now attached to an intricate necklace, sparkled as though it held a story of its own. She worked on this for 60 hours, Iron Bear said, his voice softening as he placed the necklace before Thomas. Every bead she placed with thought of you, every stitch woven as she prayed to the spirits for your survival. This is not just a gift, Thomas Whitlow. It is a symbol of what she believes in, what she hopes for. Thomas's throat tightened, and for the first time since he'd been bound to that post, he could feel something other than pain. The weight of the necklace in his hands, the warmth of the beads, the love in Winona's eyes, it all came crashing into him at once. This was not just about survival. It was about life. His life, her life, the life they could have together. His voice was raw, but filled with everything he hadn't known he was longing for. I've been dreaming of you, Winona, he whispered, his words slow but sure. I've been dreaming of your eyes, of your hands, and how you saw something in me that I never even knew was there. I never imagined that I would ever be worthy of such a love. But here you are. Winona stepped closer, her presence a balm to his battered soul. She reached for his face, her hand hovering just shy of touching him, but the gesture was enough to send a jolt of emotion through him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but filled with certainty. I asked my father to wait. I had to see you again, to know that you are the man I saw in those 3 minutes, the man who chose honor over comfort, who protected me when he could have walked away. I needed to know that what I felt for you was real. Thomas tried to straighten, but his back screamed in protest. The ropes that had held him pulling at his already broken flesh, but he did it anyway. He had to meet her gaze, had to show her that he was the man she thought he was. He looked into her eyes, and there, in her gaze, he saw everything he needed to know about their future. Ayanna. He whispered her name, as though it was a prayer. His voice cracked with emotion, but he knew that this was his moment. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a man, her man. And in that moment, the pain didn't matter. The past didn't matter. Nothing mattered but this moment, the future they could build together. Winona's expression softened, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles, and she placed the necklace into his hands, as though sealing their bond. She spoke again, her voice quieter but filled with purpose. This necklace represents everything I've prayed for, everything I've hoped for in a partner. It's not just the love of a woman, Thomas, but the hope of a future we could share together. The words fell over him like a weight, but not a burden, more like the foundation of something new, something they could build. It was more than he had ever thought possible. Iron Bear's voice broke the moment, and the weight of what he had to say next felt like a heavy stone dropped into the silence between them. I can offer you more than just my daughter's love. Thomas Whitlow, I offer you a place in my family, in our people. If you choose to accept this bond, to become my son through marriage to Winona, then you will join us, not as a foreigner or outsider, but as one of us. You will be a warrior, respected among us all, and you will have the opportunity to live a life that bridges our two worlds. Caleb felt his heart race. This was it, the moment where his future would be decided. He had lived a life of order, of duty, of rules and rank. But this was a new world entirely. The weight of tradition, of ritual, of family and people, it was overwhelming. Then it is settled, Iron Bear said, his voice now firm and commanding. The announcement caused a stir in the crowd of soldiers who had been watching silently. But now they knew they were witnessing something historic, something unprecedented. Thomas Whitlow, you will be cut down from this post. Your punishment is complete, but your journey has just begun. You will leave your soldier's life behind and become a part of our family. Colonel Whitaker stood there, torn. The weight of military duty and protocol pressed down on him, but he could not ignore the love between Caleb and Winona. He knew that this was bigger than any regulation, any rule. This was about the human heart, and how it could transcend even the most bitter of divides. Private Whitlow. Colonel Whitaker's voice was tight, his usual sternness giving way to something else. You understand that by accepting this offer, you renounce your place in the army. You will be discharged immediately. No pension, no benefits. You will leave everything you have known behind. Caleb nodded, his face steady despite the blood and exhaustion. I understand, sir, he said, his voice unwavering, and I accept those consequences. The sergeant, reluctant but following orders, moved to cut the ropes that bound Caleb to the post. As the ropes fell away, Caleb collapsed to his knees. Winona was there immediately, her hands steadying him as his strength gave way. In that moment, as Winona's touch electrified him, everything became clear. The past, the pain, the uncertainty, all of it melted away. This was where he was meant to be. Not a soldier in the army, but a man, a husband, a son, and a new family. "I've dreamed of this moment," Winona whispered, "the day when love could bridge the gap between our peoples." As Iron Bear knelt beside them, the ceremonial pipe cradled in his hands, the ritual began. It was more than just a union, it was a pact, a bond forged in the most unlikely of places. This was the beginning of a new story, a story that defied history, that reached beyond hatred, beyond bloodshed. This was a story of love. The wind had shifted, and with it came a new chapter in Thomas Whitlow's life. Just months earlier, he had stood before an impossible choice, caught between duty and love, between a life he knew and a future he couldn't yet understand. Now, as the soft sound of bells chimed and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Lakota camp, the man who had once been Private Thomas Whitlow was no more. He had been reborn as Wasson Hin Waste, a man bound to a woman, a family, and a people in a way that no military service had ever required. He sat outside the lodge he now shared with Winona, his hands working slowly through the beadwork she had taught him. Each stitch felt like a meditation, an affirmation of the life he had embraced. The scars on his back had long since healed into raised lines, telling the story of a past filled with sacrifice, but the man who wore them had changed completely. No longer was he the soldier who had taken 30 lashes for a girl he barely knew. He was now a husband, a father-to-be, and a part of something much greater. Winona emerged from their lodge, her movements graceful, a soft bundle in her arms. As she approached, Thomas's heart caught in his chest, a feeling he'd become familiar with over the past few weeks. The unmistakable curve of her belly beneath her dress signaled the life they had created together. The child they had dreamed of, even in the darkest hours of Thomas's suffering, was now real. She sat down beside him, and for a moment they both simply looked at the world around them. The sound of the river rushing by, the rhythm of the camp coming alive with the buzz of preparations for the coming winter, everything had changed in the most beautiful way. Winona unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing tiny moccasins she had made by hand. Each pair was decorated with the blue and white pattern that had become a symbol of their union, the same beads that adorned the necklace she wore every day. "Child will need strong feet for the journey ahead," she said, her voice soft, laced with the Lakota words she had begun teaching him. He reached out and touched the moccasins, marveling at the care, the love, and the effort woven into each stitch. These were more than just shoes. They were a representation of a future, a promise that their child would be part of this world, a world that was now his as much as it was Winona's. In his old life, children had been a distant dream, something to think about someday. But now, with Winona's hand resting on his arm and their child growing inside her, he could see it all: the long winters spent in the warmth of their lodge, the celebrations, the learning, the teaching. The future had never felt so real, so full of possibility. The sound of hooves broke the peaceful silence of the afternoon. Thomas looked up to see Colonel Harrison riding into camp. The precision of his military stance hadn't changed, but his expression was different. There was none of the hard, stern authority that Thomas had once known. Instead, Harrison looked weary, like a man carrying news he wished he didn't have to deliver. Iron Bear emerged from his lodge, moving with the dignified grace that made him such a respected leader. The two men who had once faced each other across the barrel of a gun now stood before one another with the respectful distance of men who had fought their battles and found common ground. Harrison dismounted, his boots hitting the earth softly, and he approached the lodge where Thomas and Winona sat. The weight of months of defending his decision was evident in the lines of his face, and as he approached, it was clear that whatever news he carried was not easy to deliver. Thomas's pulse quickened. He had not seen Harrison in weeks, not since that pivotal day when he had chosen his new life over his old one. Since then, there had been peace, a quiet understanding between the two men. But now, with the colonel's arrival, that peace seemed to be on the verge of breaking. "I never thought I'd find myself here," Harrison began, his voice heavy with the burden of his words. "When I approved your marriage, I thought it was the right thing, but the world outside our little corner of it hasn't stopped turning." Thomas could see the conflict in the colonel's eyes. Harrison had spent his career in a world defined by orders, structure, and strict boundaries. Now, he was faced with the reality of the decision he had made, and it was not a simple one. The territorial governor, Harrison continued, "He's demanding answers. There are calls for an investigation into what happened here. People want to know how a soldier who was under punishment could suddenly marry into a Lakota family. They want to know how this happened and why." Thomas's heart sank. He had known that their union wouldn't go unnoticed, but hearing it from Harrison's lips made it all the more real. There was no escaping the consequences of their choice, no matter how right it had felt in the moment. "I never asked for this," Thomas said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I'm no longer the man you once knew. I don't belong to that world anymore." Iron Bear, who had been watching the exchange in silence, stepped forward, his presence commanding. This union was not born out of convenience, nor out of defiance. It was born of love, he said, his voice calm but filled with the authority of a leader who had seen his people through countless challenges. Harrison turned his gaze toward Iron Bear, the weight of his military obligations heavy in his eyes. "Love doesn't change the fact that I have to answer to my superiors. I have to answer to the government. The Lakota may be my allies, but that doesn't change the bigger picture. This union, this marriage is something that will not be accepted by many." Winona, who had been silent up until this point, spoke softly, her words carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived through far more than her years should have allowed. "Our people don't seek acceptance from others. We don't need to be understood by those who don't wish to understand us. We make our own way, and this marriage is a testament to the strength of that path." Thomas reached for her hand, the connection between them a silent vow to stand firm in the face of whatever came next. He turned his attention back to Harrison, whose face was clouded with uncertainty. "I understand the weight of your position, Colonel," Thomas said, his voice steady. "But this is the life I choose now. I choose to stand beside Winona, and I will face whatever consequences come with that." Harrison nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling in. "Then I will do what I must to ensure you are free to live the life you've chosen. But know this, Whitlow, there will be consequences, and the road ahead will be difficult. I'm ready for it," Thomas replied, his voice unwavering. "I've made my choice." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, The last rays of light painted the sky in brilliant shades of red and orange. The Lakota camp, which had once been a place of conflict and division, was now a place of unity and possibility. Iron Bear, Winona, and Thomas stood together as a family, a symbol of what could be achieved when love transcended the boundaries of race, history, and duty. And as the stars began to appear in the sky above them, the future, once uncertain and filled with doubt, now felt full of promise and hope. The evening air was thick with the weight of decisions yet to be made. Thomas Whitlow could feel the world shifting beneath his feet, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The quiet serenity of his new life, just a few months old, was now being threatened by forces that came from a world he had hoped to leave behind. As he stood before Colonel Harrison and Iron Bear, the gravity of his situation settled heavily on his chest. "I need to speak with you, Thomas." Colonel Harrison's voice broke the stillness, his tone formal but carrying an undeniable thread of concern. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Iron Bear, ever the steady presence, joined them, his movements graceful, as though this was a discussion of great importance. Harrison continued, his words precise as though they were part of a military briefing, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. "The federal investigator I mentioned has finished his review of our operations on the frontier," Harrison began, his eyes flickering between Thomas and Iron Bear. "His report, unfortunately, is critical of how we've engaged with the local tribes. More specifically, it's raising alarms about personal relationships developing between military personnel and tribal members." Thomas's heart sank. He could see Ayanna's hand tighten on his arm, her sharp understanding of the political realities echoing his own. She had learned enough of the language to recognize the danger in Harrison's carefully worded message. There was an edge to his voice now, a threat hiding behind his official tone. Harrison paused, his jaw set in a grim line. "There's increasing pressure from Washington to normalize the situation. Some officials are suggesting that your marriage be declared invalid under federal law. They want you brought back into custody as a deserter, claiming you were unduly influenced by hostile agents." The words hit like a strike to the chest. All the love, all the sacrifices that had gone into their marriage, everything they had built, could be torn apart in an instant. Thomas could feel the weight of this new threat pressing on him, as though the past 3 months of peace and love had never happened. Iron Bear's face remained a stoic mask, but Thomas could see the simmering anger in his dark eyes. The old chief knew what this would mean, what it had meant for his people for generations, how the law of the white man had been used to oppress and destroy. Thomas felt the familiar surge of protective fury rise within him, but before he could speak, Ayanna's soft voice cut through the tension. "They would take my husband from me, just because they cannot accept that love can exist between our peoples," she said, her words calm but filled with quiet strength. She placed a hand on her growing belly, a gesture that spoke volumes. "They would declare our marriage invalid because it proves that their hatred is not the only choice." Her words rang out like a declaration, a quiet but firm refusal to be intimidated. And yet, Harrison's face showed the battle waging within him. He had spent his career in the service of rules and regulations, and this situation, this personal connection between Thomas and Ayanna, was not something he could easily reconcile with his duty. "I won't let that happen," Harrison said at last, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made up his mind. Your marriage was witnessed by federal officers, conducted according to the customs of a sovereign people, and consummated with full consent from both parties. Any attempt to invalidate it would require overturning legal precedents that go back to the founding of this country. Thomas looked up in surprise, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had not expected this kind of support from the colonel, but here it was. Yet, there was more to come. "There's another complication," Harrison continued, his voice tightening. "The territorial governor has issued an ultimatum. Either you return to military custody voluntarily, or bounty hunters will be sent to bring you back by force. The charge will be desertion during a time of war. The consequences are severe." The air around them seemed to grow even heavier, suffocating. The euphemism didn't hide the truth Thomas could be executed for his defiance. His choice to follow his heart, to marry Ayanna and leave behind the world he had known, had now painted a target on his back. The consequences of that choice were more deadly than he had ever imagined. Iron Bear's voice broke through the silence, the weight of his words striking Thomas like a blow. "And what of my daughter? What of the child she carries?" His question was direct, cutting through the fog of military protocol. Are they to be considered legitimate spoils of this white man's justice, or will they be discarded as inconvenient complications? Thomas could feel the heat of Iron Bear's words, the quiet fury that lay beneath them. This was no longer just about his fate. It was about the fate of his family, his wife, and their child. The stakes had never been so high. Harrison's face softened in genuine pain, a rare crack in his usually rigid demeanor. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with the uncertainty that had plagued him since the moment Thomas had made his choice. "The law is unclear when it comes to children born of such unions. There are precedents, but depending on who's in charge, they can be interpreted in many ways." The uncertainty of it all weighed on Thomas more than anything. The thought of Ayanna's child, their child, being caught in this legal limbo, made his heart ache. They had built a life together, a future that was supposed to be free of the hatred and division that had haunted both of their peoples for so long. And yet, now they were forced to fight for the legitimacy of that life, their love, and their future. As if summoned by the gravity of the conversation, members of the tribe began to gather around their lodge. Warriors who had once been wary of the white man in their midst now stood resolute, ready to defend him as one of their own. Women who had shared their songs and stories with Ayanna now stood in solidarity, ready to offer the same love and wisdom to the child she carried, regardless of his mixed heritage. Children who had come to see Thomas not as an outsider but as a beloved uncle who told them stories, now played at his feet. Their laughter was a reminder of what could be, a reminder that love could indeed transcend the artificial boundaries that adults insisted on creating. Thomas took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of those who had become his family, the faces of his wife, his father-in-law, the warriors who had come to call him their brother, and even the colonel who had unexpectedly become an ally. His decision, made months ago, had set him on this path, and now, as he stood on the precipice of a new choice, he felt the weight of everything once again. He had chosen love over duty, heart over regulation, hope over fear. Now, that same choice was being asked of him once again, but this time with even higher stakes and no certainty of what the future would hold. But as Ayanna's hand found his, as their unborn child moved beneath her touch, and as the silver bells of her necklace chimed softly in the breeze. Thomas knew one thing for certain: some choices, once made with a full heart, could never be unmade. The carved bird, the symbol of their love, seemed to dance in the flickering firelight, a reminder of everything they had already endured, a reminder that their love had survived 30 lashes, military regulations, and the prejudices of 2 worlds, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The story of Thomas and Ayanna offers a profound lesson in the power of courage, love, and standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. In a world where rules often govern our choices and fear can limit our actions, their journey reminds us that true strength lies in making difficult decisions from the heart. When Thomas chooses to protect Ayanna, he risks everything: his career, his freedom, and his place in society. Yet, in his act of bravery, he discovers the transformative power of love that transcends cultural divides, offering a path toward healing and unity. For those of us looking back on a lifetime of experiences, we know that the most valuable choices are often the hardest ones to make. It's not just about the easy path, but about standing for what we believe in, protecting those we love, and choosing integrity over convenience. This story teaches us that it's never too late to stand up for our values and to forge connections that go beyond societal expectations. It's a reminder that love, in its purest form, has the power to change everything. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. We appreciate your support, and we're grateful for every like, share, and subscription. Your involvement helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. We can't wait to bring you more inspiring tales.